A long road ran east from the city like a sentence written in stone. Along its shoulder, crude markers rose at measured intervals: crosses, stakes, the occasional slab with a name worn down by weather and the souls of travelers. The sun struck the white dust and made the procession glitter. Wind carried the distant bleat of animals, the clink of metal, the low murmur of a crowd gathered to watch power become punishment. Where the road curved away, an amphitheater crouched at the edge of town, its tiers full enough for a single shout to travel from one end of the world to the other. For those who walked that road in chains, every mile was an argument, every marker a lesson inscribed for the living. The state could make you small and make your smallness public. This is the story of how humiliation was made into policy, how an imperial center learned to convert shame into spectacle, into profit, into durable social order. It follows three kinds of lives: a young mother who refused what the authorities demanded of her in the name of civic piety, a routed foreign leader whose capture was rehearsed into pageantry, and the nameless multitude. Enslaved people marched along arteries of empire whose anonymity was itself the point. These are not anecdotes meant to titillate. They are evidence of institutions that engineered degradation, the mechanisms by which private suffering was turned into public teaching, and the ways memory later pushed back. Stay with these stories to the end. If preserving this history matters to you, like and subscribe so that these voices, quiet and stubborn, are not lost to the next generation. She wrote in cramped letters on a scrap of wax tablet, the lines crowded and uneven, the wax stained with a child's milk and a mother's hand. The handwriting trembled. Tonight they come to the house. They say if I do not lay my palm to the altar, I threaten my family. I dream of cold stones and of my child waking and not knowing me because of what I have done. I pray that when the magistrate asks, my father will not buy me back with his pleading. The tablet survives only as a citation in a later letter, a provincial clerk copying it into an account of trials. Even that late echo keeps the breath of the woman. A small room, the smell of lamp oil, a child's blanket folded on the bed, the distant roll of a cart on the road as officials approached. Her refusal was simple in form but devastating in effect. In a place where the rights of office and loyalty were public performances, to withhold a palm, to decline a libation, to refuse the state's demand, was to step outside the choreography of belonging. Officials treated such acts as sedition because sedition was theatrical. It required a public demonstration to strip the offender of social face. The magistrate, the clerk's record shows, ordered that she be led through the market and made to stand before the shrine. She resisted. A neighbor later wrote that she clasped her child to her breast, as if to hide him under the god's shadow. The penalty, as recorded in provincial minutes, was not merely a fine, but a public rite of correction. Hair cut short, head exposed, garments altered, a placard hung about the neck. The visible change marked her. Merchants who once bartered with her family used the placard as cause to refuse credit. A husband who might have shielded her found in law the excuse to step back. A father who pleaded for clemency was told that mercy would signal weakness and invite disorder. Humiliation, officially sanctioned, reverberated into the household economy. Legal instruments made humiliation efficient. Edicts that required open ritual performance included provisions for public exposure as a sanction. Magistrates were rewarded for upholding communal piety with social capital and sometimes with a share of confiscated property. Provincial administrators kept lists of offenders and used the spectacle of punishment as deterrent advertising. A public body whose very currency was reputation could make examples and thereby revalue loyalty. Inscriptions and official reports repeated the same logic. Obedience maintained markets and tax rolls. Dissent provoked display. Those charged with executing the spectacle, lictors, attendants, the clerks who wrote the records, were paid to make shame legible. The system made humiliation a tool of governance, a cost-effective instrument to create conformity without the expense of constant occupation. The account of the foreign leader is recorded in the pages of histories composed by men who watched triumphs as one watches staged theater. He arrived not as a man but as a script element. Captured on the frontier, he had been spared immediate slaughter in exchange for the spectacle of his defeat. His hands were bound with cord that scholars note were chosen for their symbolic color. Animals were driven before him to mock the old symmetries of his kingship. He was made to walk, at the emperor's direction, beneath triumphal arches where coffers had been set to jingle and children pelted the procession with leaves and shouted the new titles. He stepped forward with the dignity he could muster and spoke once at the judge's stand, "I did as I must for my people." The line is recorded in various forms, its variations telling us less about the exact wording than about the echo it sought to leave. A king asserting worth even in the grip of defeat. Triumphs converted political loss into communal lesson. The procession compressed conquest into narrative. The emperor's benevolence, the enemy's failure, the empire's order restored. Prisoners performed as props. Their bodies and garb taught subjects about the cost of insubordination. Officials arranged for caravans of booty and captives to finish in the arena where contests of life and death would be staged as public festivals. Vendors sold commemorative utensils, and the images of the emperor circulated as tokens in households. The spectacle was a market and a catechism. It taught status by way of example, and it extracted profit by selling the memory. For the defeated leader, the paradox was cruel. His life was preserved to be translated into moral capital for his captors. Historians who sift these processions out of fragments have argued that triumphs were less about celebrating victory than about converting the conquered into instruments of cohesion. Between the mother and the king walked the multitudes whose names rarely survive. The road registered their passage not by name but by marks. Shallow pits where a cart had overturned, spikes to tether animals, the occasional slab that declared goods moved by imperial order. Enslaved people were marched in groups that made visible the empire's reach. A line of men and women, a rope here, a weighted chain there, the odd child held by a mother whose eyes watched the horizon for a familiar face. Vendors followed such processions, and municipalities profited from the sale and punishment of captives. A municipal ledger, patched into an archive, notes costs and revenues for the maintenance of the convoy, a euphemism for provisioning people in transit. Where the road widened near a city, temporary pens were erected. Officials inspected bodies like merchandise and marked them with tags that determined destination and price. For those who survived the route, the future might be a market in which their labor and their shame were traded. The economic incentives were clear and cruel. Private contractors specialized in moving people. Local administrators levied fees for storage of captives. Markets bloomed around punishment sites because the spectacle drew spectators whose coins fed the town's coffers. Punishment and profit often went together. A gladiator's salary might be underwritten by the taxes collected from a triumph's week of vendors. Amphitheaters passed contracts with local elites to stage executions during festivals to guarantee an audience. The provision of food and lodging for the convoy created livelihoods that depended directly on the continuation of the practice. Social conditioning followed. A town that fed on the commerce of public punishment would come to see its absence as a threat to prosperity. What began as an occasional punitive display hardened into an industry. Yet the sources also show resistance threaded through routine degradation. Inscriptions later found in villages along the road carry names that an official account had tried to erase. A fragmentary graffito reads like an afterthought, "For Aelia, who kept the palm." It is brief, without flourish, but its existence unmakes the magistrate's script that would have reduced Aelia to a marker. Diaries, letters, and even legal appeals preserved a stubborn interior life that public spectacle sought to flatten. The mother who refused the right, the leader who spoke in the trampling, the invisible crowds, each left traces of selfhood. They contested the message of the stage not by overthrowing it, but by surviving, by keeping a record, by whispering names to children. Where an amphitheater sought to teach obedience, memory taught something else, that humiliation could not fully extinguish personhood. Listen to how the noise of the crowd functions in the sources. At the amphitheater, the crowd's roar is recorded as a variable instrument, sometimes complicit, sometimes uncertain. Sellers hawked their wares, roasted grain and salted fish, small tokens stamped with the emperor's visage. Spectators cheered at spectacle, but scholars reading the margins see ambivalence. A woman in the front row who tucked a coin into the palm of a captive. A youth who refused to spit as the procession passed. The crowd, that diffuse actor of socialization, was never monolithic. Its presence amplified the state's lesson. Its fissures showed how the lesson might be resisted. There were mechanics the empire used to cultivate such crowds. Officials controlled sightlines, placing platforms so that the magistrate's gestures would reach the most eyes. Religious ritual and martial display were woven together. Priests, lictors, and standard-bearers moved in sequences rehearsed to elicit awe. Subsidies for festival days ensured that a city had no reason to miss the show. Reward structures, citizenship favors, grain doles, contract opportunities were dispersed to those who publicly approved. The architecture itself taught subordination. The amphitheater's design ensured that the powerful towered, the punished were contained. In short, the state designed humiliation as pedagogy. Not all humiliation proceeded through law and theater. There were subtler forms: economic, civic, symbolic. A woman marked as a dissenter found herself refused passage across a river. A merchant who sheltered a known offender lost his seat at the market. A son who publicly spoke for his mother watched his apprenticeship evaporate. The social currency of reputation had measurable value. To damage it was to inflict real poverty. Rome's system thus combined blunt spectacle and intricate social engineering. Its penalties were calibrated to be both visible and contagious. And yet humiliation was not uniformly effective. The very visibility that made punishment an instrument of control also created archives of resistance. A child's lullaby whispered at the bones of a roadside marker might later become a hymn for a new community. Those who refused to perform allegiance, like the young mother on her tablet, sometimes turned the state's mechanism back upon itself. Her refusal produced, in letters that circulated, a narrative of witness that inspired others. Martyrdom, in many recorded cases, altered the rhetorical balance. A public death intended as a lesson could become a site of sanctification for those who regarded the punished as morally exemplary. The state's attempt to script meaning was never entirely successful. The cumulative effect built toward a contradiction. The empire wanted uniformity. Humiliation produced visibility. Visibility produced record. Records fed communities that would preserve names against obliteration. In some provinces, acts of degradation became the seedbeds of collective memory, and memory a slow, latent force that carried stories across decades. Monuments replaced with new dedications bore under their stones inscriptions that later hands would read as signs of prior contestation. Scholars unearthing an overturned slab find beneath the official text graffiti that says only "remember." The empire could erase words, but not always the act of remembering itself. This pattern reaches a telling apex when one follows the three trajectories together. The mother who refused ritual gives rise to letters that circulate and name her as witness. The leader's procession becomes a spectacle recorded in histories that also narrates his last dignified speech. The convoys of enslaved bodies leave, in municipal ledgers and in roadside marks, a ledger of commerce that later generations will dig up and interpret as commerce built on suffering. The interlocking record, private caprices preserved in notebooks, public inscriptions, bureaucratic ledgers, creates a mosaic in which humiliation and remembrance become locked in uneasy tension. The moral thrust becomes unavoidable. The state engineered humiliation because it worked, but its very mechanisms produce the seeds of moral reckoning. If we fast forward, guided by these archival traces, the resonance continues. Religious movements that grew in proximity to these spectacles, movements that later historians note as steadying forces in the provinces, found in the public punishments both a crucible and a witness. Martyr narratives give names and faces to the anonymous, turning penal display into testimony. On the one hand, the public ritualized degradation; on the other, memory ritualized dignity. The amphitheater stone heard both the voice of the magistrate and the whispered prayers of those who would refuse the demand for obeisance. Later generations would return to those sites and read the ruins as contested ground. Was the space a theater of imperial triumph or a tomb of dissent? Sometimes it was both. Modern ears, listening to these echoes, must ask uncomfortable questions. Institutions still learn to monetize attention. Spectacle still shapes public morality. The social mechanisms that converted humiliation into governance in antiquity, visible punishment, economic incentives for crowds, ritualized marking, have modern analogs in practices that make pain and shame public for profit or control. Drawing the line between analogy and equivalence requires care. Ancient amphitheaters and contemporary platforms are not the same. Yet the same human dynamics, audience appetite, economic interest, institutional will, reappear. That is why remembering matters. Remembering what was done, to whom, and how it was justified allows a society to interrogate the structures that produce public degradation in its own time. For the moment, return to the road. Imagine the mother walking, the leader processed, the convoys trampled under cartwheels. Imagine the roped-off amphitheater and the vendors hawking trinkets stamped with triumphal emblems. Now imagine, too, a child years later tracing with fingertips the shallow letters on a marker, "To the unknown," and learning a name from a grandmother who had once hidden the memory in a song. The road is both scar and archive. Its markers demand to be read. In the archives, scholars still disagree about particulars. How many markers were placed in any given year? Which edict authorized a particular punishment? Whether a given leader's speech was recorded verbatim or shaped by later taste? These debates do not dilute the larger claim. The institutions of the empire routinized public humiliation as a means of social control. The methods varied: legal enactments, triumphal processions, market arrangements, but the outcome was consistent. Humiliation became a resource to be deployed, and resources, once commodified, entrench themselves. There is a final moral pivot here, a point where historical description must yield to civic insistence. To remember is not merely to catalog. It is to place oneself in a line of responsibility. The tiny graffiti that reads, "Remember," is not a neutral note. It is a demand. It asks the reader, now in another age, to notice the patterns and to resist their easy return. To look away is to be complicit in letting shame become legible currency again. As dusk draws down on the road, the last of the day's spectators fold their garments and leave. The amphitheater grows mute. Under the slab marked by weather, the names that survive, some carved, some whispered, hold a fragile power. They insist that a life once used to teach obedience was more than a lesson. They insist that what happened at the puppeted crossroads was not merely administrative necessity, but moral choice. We still can choose how to remember. If these histories matter to you, if naming and remembering feel like a small defense against systems that would profit from public degradation, take a moment now to subscribe and share this work. Preservation is not passive. It is an act. Remembering honors those who were made small and makes us watchful of systems that would repeat their methods. The road bends toward the city's gates. Beyond them, in repositories of clay tablets and brittle ledgers, more scraps wait to be read. There are letters yet to translate, inscriptions yet to weather into legibility, commons yet to be excavated. The next voice we follow will be that of a woman who kept a ledger of names, an attempt, modest and stubborn, to count and name the anonymous. She will show how even accounting can be an act of resistance, how enumerating the people turned into commodities recovers their personhood. She kept the book in a low chest beneath the loom, not in a temple nor atop the public ledgers, for she knew that counting in plain sight would invite the same eyes that loved spectacle. The volume was small, boards wrapped in worn leather, its spine pulled tight with thread that had been redone more than once. The first folios had been eaten by damp. The later pages were fresh with a hand that, at times, trembled and at times wrote with the quick economy of someone who must both record and hide. Her entries were not neat catechisms of bureaucracy. They crouched like private offerings. A name when it could be learned, Lysanias, son of Demos. An epithet when that was all surviving witnesses could offer, woman, gray hair. A location, by the northern pump, near the plastered crossroad. A slender notation of what had happened. Put to cart, no bargain. Released for coin, half. Sometimes she copied the petty phrases the magistrate used, for the public good, and set them in a column opposite the human line, as if the ledger were a place for contradiction to meet. Marginalia grew into a second text. She wrote songs there, fragments of the lullabies mothers hummed to steady children while the procession passed. She drew the small sigils traders used to mark unsold goods. She penciled a crude map of the market where a particular name had been taken. When a witness returned, shaken and grateful, she redacted a line and, with a slash that was almost a benediction, wrote the person's proper name beside the strike. The act of striking the anonymous and restoring a name was, for her, the work itself, a refusal to let persons dissolve into lessons. Her method was simple and stubborn. She kept 2 columns of memory. One was public, dates and tenths and measures, the arithmetic language the city understood. The other was stubbornly intimate, ages, small trades, how a person held their head. She annotated with a shorthand that meant little to clerks, but everything to neighbors. A loop for debt, a dot for a child at home, a cross for a relation who had spoken with her that day. In time, these signs gathered a grammar of care. She did not imagine the ledger would survive her. On evenings when the moon slanted through the shutters, she would press her thumb in the seam, feeling the raised ink like the pulse of the city. When the raids came and the carts rattled through the quarter, she slid the book into a jar buried under the hearthstone. She spoke the names aloud until memory itself might carry them if parchment failed. Years later, when a granddaughter, then old, then resolute, unlocked the jar, she read the ledger aloud to a child who could not pronounce all the names. The song the grandmother had recorded returned in small, decisive fragments, and a new voice learned to put syllables to a life. To enumerate had been, for that woman, a sacrament. To name was to reconfigure the ledger of value. To insist that lives could not be reduced to lessons stamped out for an audience. The engraving of small, precise letters under a pale lamp became a counter-memory, quietly rearranging what the road had tried to fix forever. The pages of that book would pass into repositories, be catalogued and mistranslated and catalogued again. But on the folio where her hand lingered longest, one finds a last entry written not in the measured ink of accounting, but in the hurried black of someone who expected interruption. A name, then a breath, then a sentence that read like a promise to the reader centuries on. The sentence is not loud. It is a work of steadiness. I remember them. When, in years of dust and unrolling, the ledger is opened, those small lines do most of their work, not as spectacle, but as testament. They do not cancel the road's ruins. They do not erase the amphitheater's appetite. They are, instead, a quieter kind of resistance, counting as an act of preservation, a ledger as a vessel for dignity. In the margins of market signs and lullaby fragments, the anonymous are named back into being, and the record insists on a different economy, one that prices persons by remembrance rather than by humiliation. The ledger would not rest in silence. In one century, it lay folded among other curiosities, a thing to be photographed and placed behind glass with a placard that misread the looped shorthand as a merchant's mark rather than a child's absence. In another, it was carried from archive to archive, wrapped in cloth, its leather softened by many hands who never read past the first few lines. Libraries argued over accession numbers and provenance. Scholars argued over the ledger's date, its dialect, the political economy that had made names into receipts. Each interpretation tried to fit the small book into a larger story, of tax registers, of punitive expeditions, of the machinery of spectacle, and in doing so, sometimes flattened the edges that the woman had felt with her thumb. There were, however, readerly resistances. A cataloger who had spent evenings tracing the woman's shorthand with a fine pencil set aside the official file and, at home, read the folios aloud to his sleeping son. A graduate student, frustrated with footnotes that turned whole lives into parenthetical clauses, wrote a short paper about the ledger's marginalia and handed out copies of the lullaby fragments at a conference. The audience, expecting technical argument, found themselves humming an anonymous melody in the corridor. A public historian, who had once stood at a monument and found only a sequence of dates where she had wanted faces, petitioned to include a photographic facsimile of the book in a small exhibit of memory, not explained by policy, but hung so that visitors might touch the page with their eyes. The ledger's stubborn intimacies slipped through the cracks of interpretation like light through a shutter. Scholars could debate the economy of cartage and release. Activists could track the ledger's listings against municipal roll calls. Yet time and again it was the simple act of reading that reconstituted the lives. Names spoken aloud gathered an attention that lists on a page could not demand. Speech made room for the pauses the woman had left between words, the breath that followed an entry, the slashed line that had been a benediction. On a pale afternoon, in a room where dust motes moved like a small congregation, a reader assembled what she could. She was neither famous nor particularly credentialed, only the sort of person who had learned, through errant apprenticeships and volunteer shifts, where books like this hid when institutions wished them neutral. The desk was a narrow altar. The ledger lay open to the page where the hurried black script had paused, where the promise, "I remember them," had been written as if to a companion and to some future who might need to be named. She read the names in order. At first they sounded like syllables gleaned from weathered clay, consonants clipped by time, vowels wandering. But the act of enunciation gathered them into persons. She let each name rest. When she came to the shorthand, those small loops and dots and crosses that had become a grammar of care, she translated them not into taxonomy, but into gestures. Debt, tended by neighbor, she would say. Child at home, bread shared. Where the magistrate had offered, for the public good, she read the countertext aloud, for the child who lingered at the stall. Each phrase reshaped the ledger back toward the woman's own method. 2 columns of memory, one public and one intimate, balanced again in voice. People in the reading room clustered without deciding to. A curator, who had been cataloging an unrelated bundle, paused at the doorway. A student who had been researching amphitheaters sat down on the farthest bench and put away a notebook. Even a maintenance worker rested his broom beside a column. There are small economies of attention. The room redistributed itself around the act that refused spectacle. As names accumulated, the air, already dry from parchment, took on the texture of presence. Near the end, the reader came upon entries that had been slashed and then were stored. Each stroke told a story of return. A woman struck out as anonymous, then, by a witness's word or the woman's own insistence in the market, restored to name. The reader paused at one such restoration, and, thinking of the woman who had scratched the ledger in candlelight, and of the granddaughter who had later read the song aloud, closed her eyes. She wrote them back, the reader said, not as a discovery, but as an observation. The sentence made the room acknowledge that memory could be an act of making, not merely an act of recovering. Word left the room in the minimal ways that news of tenderness travels. It spread by foot and by whispered invitation. It spread as a rumor of a small liturgy within the open stacks. Within a week, a neighboring institution asked if a facsimile could be borrowed for a community evening. Permission, once bureaucratically negotiated, was given with an addendum. The ledger itself would not leave the safety of its storage. A digital reproduction would be shown instead. Some protested that the reproduction could never carry the thumb's impression the way the original could. Others, mindful of preservation, accepted the trade. The reproduction, projected onto a pale scrim, filled a small hall. People came in work clothes, in scholarly garb, in the loose linen of those who had walked a distance to be there. The reproduction captured the scrawl but not the texture. Still, there was an intimacy in watching ink enlarge until its quiver could be seen. A woman who had come with a tape measure of her own family's history leaned forward and cried quietly when she recognized the form of a name she had been taught as a child. A boy copied a loop of the shorthand into his notebook, and then, in the margin where someone had once placed a dot, wrote the word mother. After the reading, people stood in small clusters and told the ledger's stories as if it were only one among many. Someone described how a grandmother had once carried a list of names folded into her shawl like charms. Another spoke of an uncle who refused memorial stones because he trusted remembrance to speech. The conversations were not uniform in tone. There was criticism, there was disagreement over what remembering should require. But the ledger had shifted the terms of debate. People began to imagine commemoration less as carving and more as reckoning. A day when names would be spoken at squares, when a market might pause for a minute to listen, when registers would be annotated with the shorthand of care. In the years that followed, small practices took root. A school near the hall incorporated the reading into a curriculum of local memory. Students learned not merely to recite dates, but to ask after the life behind each entry. A municipal ceremony, modest, resisted, persistent, began asking families to submit names of those who had been rendered into numbers by older ledgers. The city created spaces, benches, boards, walls that invited names written by hand rather than cut in stone. None of these acts erased the amphitheater's appetite. The public mechanisms that had punished and profited remained. But the ledger's insistence had unclenched a habit: to refuse the economy that priced persons at their utility, and instead to demand that someone speak the syllables that otherwise might be swallowed by time. And in a private room, years after the original jar had been unearthed, a child, the same child who had once mispronounced a name, now an adult, stood with a copy of the ledger in her hands. She traced the loop that meant debt, remembered her grandmother's hand slashing and restoring. She set the book on a table and called to the small group gathered: neighbors, a scholar, a woman who had once catalogued entries and kept one page folded under her pillow for a while. They did not speak in ceremony so much as in the domestic key of making. Names were read, bits of life were offered, recipes were swapped. An argument about whether a particular marking meant sickness or famine was settled with a story of a harvest that had failed. At the closing, the adult read the last hurried sentence aloud, those 3 steady words that had crossed the ages with the force of a vow. The sentence, spoken in the warm, ordinary voice of someone not on a podium but at a kitchen table, made the room tilt toward the memory it had been gathered to shore up. "I remember them," she said. It was not a claim of miraculous retrieval. It was not a syllable to defeat the amphitheater. It was, rather, an ordinary liturgy, a promise renewed by speech, a ledger continued in the mouths of people who would not let names fall into accounting again. The small sigils in the margins, the loops and dots and crosses, kept their grammar. They traveled now from hand to hand, taught in evenings by people who had learned to read the indebtedness of a neighbor as a charge to care. The city kept many records. The world kept many spectacles. The ledger, having outlived both appetite and ruin, taught a different economy, that remembrance itself is a form of valuation, that to name is to hold, and that a life priced by memory might yet tilt the balance, in small and stubborn ways, toward dignity. When the lights were low and visitors drifted away, the child, now steady with years, pressed her thumb into the seam of the copy, feeling, for a moment, the raised ink as if it were a pulse. The gesture was the old woman's gesture, learned across generations. In houses, in halls, and by market pumps, the practice continued. Names said aloud, loops drawn in margins, a ledger's quiet work passing from hand to hand until speech itself became a kind of archive. So the counting endured, not as an arithmetic of loss, but as a litany of presence. Names, when spoken, rearranged the city's ledger. The amphitheater's appetite remained part of the world, yet against it, in rooms both small and public, people kept returning to the book and doing the work the woman had done by the lamp. They did not seek spectacle. They sought steadiness, to keep a list of the living in order by remembering them out loud, with the same soft insistence of a hand that writes a name and, with a slash that is almost a benediction, restores a life to its proper place.